Howdy and good morning, faithful listeners. Today we're going to be discussing the last half of 2 Kings chapter 9, where we'll talk about the end of the Omri dynasty of Israel and also the death of Queen Jezebel. We'll get into that in a second. So we're going to be jumping around in scripture quite a bit today. And so I'm going to be reading our primary portion out of the WEB, but then when I jump to different passages, I'll be reading from the NIV today. So grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea. I've got a cup of apple cinnamon tea. It's very cinnamony. It's good. I like it, but I'm not the biggest fan of the taste of cinnamon, but it's still a good tea. But you grab your favorite hot beverage this morning as we discuss the end of 2 Kings 9, 21 through 37. Joram said, "Get ready." They got his chariot ready. Then Joram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot, and they went out to meet Jehu. They found him on Naboth the Jezreelite's land. When Joram saw Jehu, he said, "Is it peace, Jehu?" He answered, "What peace, so long as the prostitution of your mother Jezebel and her witchcraft abound?" Joram turned his hands and fled, and said to Ahaziah, "This is treason, Ahaziah." Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and struck Joram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart, and he sunk down in his chariot. Then Jehu said to Bidkar, his captain, "Pick him up and throw him in the plot of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. For remember how, when you and I rode together after Ahab his father, Yahweh laid this burden on him. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, says Yahweh, and I will repay you in this plot of ground, says Yahweh. Now therefore take and cast him onto the plot of ground according to Yahweh's word." But when Ahaziah the king of Judah saw this, he fled by the way of the garden house. Jehu followed after him and said, "Strike him also in the chariot." They struck him at the ascent of Gur, which is by Iblaim. He fled to Megiddo and died there. His servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in his tomb with his fathers in David's city. In the 11th year of Joram the son of Ahab, Ahaziah began to reign over Judah. When Jehu had come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out at the window. As Jehu entered in at the gate, she said, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, you murderer of your master?" He lifted up his face to the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. He said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses. Then he trampled her underfoot. When he had come in, he ate and drank. Then he said, "See now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." They went to go bury her, but they found no more of her than the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands. Therefore they came back and told him. He said, "This was Yahweh's word, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, the dogs will eat the flesh of Jezebel on the plot of Jezreel. And the body of Jezebel will be as dung on the surface of the field on Jezreel's land, so that they won't say, 'This is Jezebel.'" So where we left off last time, in 2 Kings 9, the first portion, we were talking about how the dynasty of Omri was about to come to the end. And you remember Omri, he was a wicked king of Israel, and he was the father of Ahab, and then Ahab was the father of Joram or Jehoram, depending on the day. Scripture just interchanges his name whenever they feel like it. But Jehoram is easier for me to say than Joram, so I'm going to say Jehoram if you guys don't mind. But Jehoram was the son of King Ahab. And you guys remember that all 3 of those kings were very terrible, very wicked kings, caused a lot of destruction for Israel. And so now their dynasty is about to end. But one thing that I sort of forgot about that happened, which I should have mentioned on Monday, but I did not, was that Elijah had actually gone and anointed Jehu before Elisha's prophet did. And I totally forgot about this. This is back in 1 Kings chapter 19. Do you guys remember the chapter where Elijah went up to the mountain because he was in so much distress, and then God came to him in a still small voice? Do you guys remember that story? Well, right after God appears to Elijah, he actually gives Elijah a few tasks, and one of them was to anoint Jehu. So let's go back to 1 Kings 19, and I'll read verses 15 through 18 and talk about this. It says, and this is out of the NIV, "The Lord said to him, 'Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha the son of Shaphat from Abel-Meholah to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him.'" Elijah was supposed to go anoint Jehu, and apparently he did. And I'm sure that that was very meaningful to Jehu. And then, of course, in the chapter that we read today, the first portion of it, which we talked about on Monday, Jehu got anointed again by Elisha's prophet. So at this point in time, Jehu has been anointed twice. And I'm sure that he is taking that role pretty seriously as a brand new king. You'll actually see a lot of times when God anoints a new king, sometimes they actually start out pretty good, but then they sort of go off the deep end once they get really power hungry and stuff like that. That happens quite a bit with the kings that God anoints. David was the exception to that rule. But just like some of those other kings, Jehu is starting out his career as king by doing what God actually tells him to do, which was to destroy the entire house of Ahab, because Ahab was a terrible king, a very murderous king. And also he married Jezebel, who was a Phoenician witch who introduced Baal worship into Israel. And Jezebel herself was also a murderer as well. So Jehu is tasked with doling out the judgment of God. So that is what he is off to do. And so Jehoram, who is the current king of Israel and who is rather sick because he got injured in battle, he's resting in Jezreel. And he sees Jehu with a big army coming towards him. And he doesn't suspect anything yet. He thinks everything is fine. So Jehoram, who is still recovering, he tells his servant to get his chariot ready in verse 21 of 2 Kings 9. And it says, "They got his chariot ready. Then Jehoram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot, and they went to meet Jehu and found him on Naboth the Jezreelite's land. So when Jehoram saw Jehu, he said, 'Is this peace, Jehu?' And Jehu answered, 'What peace could there be as long as the prostitution of your mother Jezebel and her witchcraft abound?' And that immediately tells King Jehoram that Jehu is here to kill him. So Jehoram turns around as fast as he possibly can in his chariot, and he yells to his nephew, King Ahaziah, who is up visiting him. He says, 'This is treason, Ahaziah. Get away, run away.' So as these two kings are running away in their chariots, it says Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and struck Jehoram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart. So it went straight through him. And Jehoram died immediately in his chariot. So then Jehu says to Bidkar, his current captain, he says, 'Pick him up and throw him in this plot of land, the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. For remember how when you and I rode together after Ahab his father, Yahweh laid this burden on Ahab. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, says Yahweh, and I will repay you in this plot of ground, says Yahweh. Now therefore take and cast Jehoram onto the plot of ground according to Yahweh's word.'" And this is referring to what Ahab did back in 1 Kings. Ahab had actually killed this innocent man named Naboth, and also Naboth's sons as well. And Jezebel had a hand in this also, because Ahab wanted Naboth's piece of land for a veggie garden, because it was more convenient for him to have Naboth's land. But Naboth wouldn't sell it to him, because Naboth wanted to keep this piece of land in his family. So Ahab murders everybody in Naboth's family so that he can now acquire this plot of land. So for this little plot of land, Ahab and Jezebel murdered an entire family just for a vegetable garden. And so God was so angry with Ahab. He told Ahab, you're going to get paid back in this very plot of land that you murdered somebody for. And after that, Ahab did kind of have a come to God moment, sort of. And he humbled himself. And so God relented a little bit on his punishment of Ahab and said he would actually punish Ahab's son, Jehoram, instead of Ahab in that way. But Ahab also was punished quite severely. But now Jehoram is the one who is going to be thrown in this plot of land. And so that is what Jehu does. He kills Jehoram, just as God told him to do, and he puts the body in the plot of land that belonged to Naboth and Naboth's sons. But Ahaziah, who was the king of Judah and also the nephew of Jehoram, sees all of this go down, and he flees. It says he fled by the way of the garden house, and Jehu followed after him and said, "Strike him also in his chariot." And so they did strike him at the ascent of Gur, which is by Iblaim. And he fled to Megiddo and died there. So his servants carried him home to Jerusalem and buried him in his tomb with his fathers in David's city. So King Ahaziah of Judah was also related to King Ahab. He was the grandson of King Ahab because Ahaziah's mother was Ahab's daughter. And this is all laid out in 2 Chronicles chapter 22. Let's go ahead and read that, verses 2 through 9. It says, Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became the king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 1 year. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He too followed in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother encouraged him to act wickedly. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done, for after his father's death, they became his advisers to his undoing. He also followed their counsel when he went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, to wage war against Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead. The Arameans wounded Jehoram, so he returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds which they had inflicted on him at Ramoth in his battle with Hazael, the king of Aram. Then Ahaziah went down to Jezreel to see Jehoram, the son of Ahab, because he had been wounded. Through Ahaziah's visit to Jehoram, God brought about Ahaziah's downfall. When Ahaziah arrived, he went out with Joram to meet Jehu, the son of Nimshi, whom the Lord had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. While Jehu was executing the judgment on the house of Ahab, he found the officials of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's relatives who had been attending Ahaziah, and he killed them. He then went in search of Ahaziah, and his men captured him while he was hiding in Samaria. He was brought to Jehu and put to death. They buried him, for they said he was a son of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart. So there was no one in the house of Ahaziah powerful enough to retain the kingdom. So that's what happened to Judah after Ahaziah was killed by Jehu. And you might be wondering, well, why did Jehu kill Ahaziah? Why did he do that? That seems really, really bad. Well, the reason he did that was because Ahaziah was related to Ahab. And you'll remember at the beginning of 2 Kings chapter 9, when Jehu is anointed for the second time, the prophet actually tells Jehu that God is anointing him to dole out the judgment on Ahab's entire family, and not a single male of Ahab's family would survive this ordeal. And so since Ahaziah was a direct grandson, directly related to Ahab, Jehu also killed Ahaziah. And honestly, because Ahaziah was such a wicked king for Judah, God used Jehu to kill Ahaziah. That is what it says in 2 Chronicles 22. It says, through Ahaziah's visit to Jehoram, God brought about Ahaziah's downfall. So God used Jehu to punish King Ahab and Ahab's entire family, and that included Ahaziah as well. So moving forward in the story, after Ahaziah has now died and Jehoram has now died, it says that Jehu had come to Jezreel, and Jezebel heard about it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out of the window. So she's waiting for Jehu to get there because she finds out that her son has died and that Jehu is on this rampage and is taking the throne for himself. So what she does is she dresses up. And not to like seduce Jehu or anything. Most likely she was dressing up because she knew she was going to die. And she wanted to be buried with her hair done up and her makeup on and everything in place and everything looking good. That is how she wanted to die. So she waits by the window and sees Jehu coming. And it says in verse 31 of 2 Kings 9, as Jehu entered in through the gate, she said, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, you murderer of your master?" And you might be like, what is she talking about here? Because who's Zimri? If I'm being honest, I completely forgot who Zimri was because he was such an unimportant king that like he just fully left my brain. So Zimri was a king mentioned back in 1 Kings chapter 16, okay? Zimri was king for about a week. He was the guy who killed Baasha, okay? So Baasha was a pretty famous king. I believe Baasha was the second dynasty of Israel, and then technically Zimri was the third dynasty. So Zimri went and killed Baasha, became king for about 7 days, but he was so unsuccessful, he died pretty much immediately. It says in 1 Kings 16, 15 through 20, in the 27th year of Asa, the king of Judah, Zimri reigned in Tirzah for 7 days. The army was encamped near Gibbethon, a Philistine town. When the Israelites in the camp heard that Zimri had plotted against the king and murdered him, they proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that very day there in the camp. Then Omri and all the Israelites with him withdrew from Gibbethon and laid siege to Tirzah. When Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him. And so he died because of the sins that he had committed, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and following the ways of Jeroboam and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. So that is who Jezebel is referring to when she calls Jehu Zimri right here in 2 Kings chapter 9. She is insulting Jehu by saying, "Oh, Jehu, you're just like Zimri. You are so pathetic that you are never going to be successful. You will die in a week, and you will die because the dynasty of Omri is so much better than you are. So Omri's dynasty is going to find a way to take you out, just as Omri took out Zimri before." So basically, Jezebel is calling Jehu pathetic, is what she's doing here. So Jehu doesn't even respond to her. Instead, he looks up at the palace and yells so that the people inside can hear. And he says, "Who is on my side? Who?" And it says in verse 32 that 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. And he tells the eunuchs, "Throw Jezebel down to the ground." And she was up pretty high in this palace, high enough that when these eunuchs threw her down, she actually, her blood like splattered everywhere, which is kind of grotesque, but that's what it says. So she died pretty much immediately on impact. It says they threw her down and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses. So Jehu trampled her underfoot, and this would have been a deep, deep insult for Jehu to do, because back in these days, you were supposed to treat the dead body of somebody with great respect. It was actually considered a fate worse than death if your body was left out in the open, or if you desecrated a body in some way. That was a fate worse than death. So Jehu does the ultimate insult to Jezebel by destroying her dead body, basically. And he is completely insolent about this. It says he trampled her under the horse's feet, and then he went into the palace and ate and drank. So he's now living like a king. Then after a while, he's like, "Oh yeah, Jezebel's still out there on the ground." And he tells a servant, he's like, "All right, go see to that cursed woman Jezebel out there, because you got to bury her. I mean, she is a king's daughter, so at least give her some respect." So the servants go out to try to find Jezebel's body. and all they find was her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. So they came back inside and they told him. And Jehu is unsurprised. He says, well, this was Yahweh's word, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, the dogs will eat the flesh of Jezebel on the plot of Jezreel, and the body of Jezebel will be as dung on the surface of the field on Jezreel's land, so that they won't say, this is Jezebel. This is actually prophesied about multiple times, that Jezebel would be eaten by wild dogs. And so that ended up happening. Jezebel's body was eaten by wild dogs, and the rest of her body was dumped on top of the land that she stole from Naboth. And her body became as fertilizer for the ground for Naboth's property. So that is what became of Jezebel. She did up her hair for nothing. She put her makeup on for nothing. She was insolent to the very end, and the prophecies about her came true, that she would die a horrific death and her body would literally turn into fertilizer for Naboth's property. So now God has given Naboth and Naboth's family the justice that they deserved. Faithful listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode and listening to the end of the Omri dynasty of Israel. I believe this was the 4th dynasty, if I'm remembering correctly, of Israel. And we're about to move into the 5th dynasty of Israel. So we'll see. Was Jehu a better king? Yes or no? We'll find out soon on the podcast. So please tune in on Monday to hear more about 2 Kings and see what happens next in the story. Or if you'd like to join me on the New Testament side of stuff, then tune in tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up, because we'll be discussing the book of Galatians tomorrow. Hope to see you all then. Happy listening, and God bless.